stretching back to Jerusalem in the year 1048. It was founded by a group of merchants from the Italian state of Amalfi, and based on the rule of the Benedictine Catholic religious order, the Knights founded a religious community which dedicated itself to the care of pilgrims in the Holy Land, and later enlarged to provide hospice and medical care to all who came through its doors, irrespective of religion or secular commitment. Back then, its patients were served on silver trays, and they drank from crystal glasses, embodying a tradition that every patient at this hospital was a creation of God, and therefore, in their own right, was every bit a lord and a lady, and deserved to be treated as such. Today, the order thrives as a sovereign entity, similar to a state with territory, but with a much, much larger, broad international outreach. Until the Napoleonic Wars, we had been the rulers of countries that are now Malta and Cyprus. And while at the end of the Napoleonic era, we were denied the opportunity to claim back our territory, the Concert of Europe, a forerunner of the League of Nations of the UN, decreed to both recognize and guarantee our sovereignty, despite the loss of the island of Malta. And there we are today, on the Via Condotti, in the middle of Rome, and in the Aventine Hills, you will find the center of our government, where our elected head of state, the Grand Master, lives and works, and where our administrative infrastructure, including several hundred full-time staff, along with the regional and desk staff, perform their functions. The Order of Malta's modern-day role is largely focused on providing humanitarian assistance, and our involvement with the humanitarian world is something that gives us permanent observer status at the UN since 1994. Across the world, we employ approximately 60,000 doctors, nurses, auxiliaries and paramedics, assisted by over 100,000 volunteers in more than 120 countries, assisting everyone, orphans, displaced children, the homeless, disabled, the elderly, victims of human trafficking, the terminally ill, refugees, lepers, without any distinction of ethnicity or religion. And our worldwide relief corps, Malteser International, aids victims of natural disasters, epidemics, and war. We maintain diplomatic relations with 113 countries. We enter into treaties, we issue our own passports, coins, and postage stamps. Our two headquarter buildings in Rome have extraterritoriality similar to embassies, while we maintain embassies in other countries. Let me note, however, that in my remarks here today, I do not represent the views of the Sovereign Order of Malta. And what I'm going to say to you today does not reflect either the opinions of any of my colleagues. They are solely my own personal views, drawn from my experience at the United Nations and my experience working for the Sovereign Order of Malta. I would like to invoke the prerogative of the Chatham House rules for my address here today. If you're unfamiliar with Chatham House rules, check Google. I love Google. It tells you everything you ever wanted to know about nothing and everything else. I arrived at my post in New York 6 months before COVID began to exercise its grim domination, and my spring of anticipation was quickly dashed by a long winter of seclusion. But through the advantage of Zoom and other applications, I saw almost immediately and at close hand how the UN strives to come to terms, albeit remotely, with global problems beyond anyone's control, and at the same time, the incredible global machinery of the UN continued to provide services and to support the needy throughout the world. I realized and remain committed to the reality that for all its problems and faults, the world needs the United Nations. Why? Because it represents a voice of reason in a world that's often drowned out by the bully and the demagogue, and unfortunately, where the media sometimes has an overweening influence, not always for the good. It is now the only place in the world where all nations, big and small, powerful and weak, rich and poor, have an equal voice, and which provides an environment where all can be heard and can make a contribution to remedy the world's problems. From my vantage point at the UN, I have seen clearly that the once touted advantage of multilateralism, which most of my colleagues at the UN are committed to, is, however, taking a beating in the face of a rising tide of nationalist and populist governments that seem to surprise the electorate that brings them to power even more than their rise to power surprises the external observer. Recent electoral results in the Netherlands, in Argentina, and in Slovakia will attest to this trend. The philosopher George Santayana is credited with the prescient comment that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This is a sentiment that history repeats itself, is one that resonates with our common sense, and it's very hard to disagree with it. For example, in the history of the US and Europe, wars have ended with forced surrender and the confiscation of large tracts of land, the result breeding resentment and a desire for retribution and revenge. The devastations of towns and cities, the imposition of almost impossible restitution funds, furthered burning desires to return to a status quo. One notable historical exception to this was America's response to Germany in 1945 with its Soviet Marshall Plan, which avoided a repeat of the economic crisis that destroyed the Weimar Republic. Revolutions like those in France and Russia gave an individual absolute power, Napoleon and Stalin respectively, and they inevitably ended up as failed empires and devolved into brutal dictatorships. In the 21st century, specific events in Syria have proven a repeated lesson about civil wars, like the Vietnam War, that when external powers, great or small and aspiring, engage in proxy intervention, conflict becomes protracted, enabling some leaders to luxuriate in power while the masses suffer, or in some cases, reducing countries to the status of failed state. Tragically, we see this model repeated time and time again, now in Yemen, in Libya, maybe in the Ukraine, previously Lebanon, and many other locations. The New York Times journalist David Leonhardt, writing in the aftermath of the October 7th atrocities committed by Hamas against Israel, summed up, in my estimation, a prescient observation on the evolution of a new world order. He highlights the decline of multilateralism and points to a greater emphasis on selective bilateralism as nations begin to eschew the global agencies like the United Nations that were once considered our only hope. This new world order is based, in Leonhardt's view, on the principle not of multilateralism, but a new multipolarism. At its heart, this new dogma asserts that the United States is no longer the dominant power it once emerged. As a consequence of this, amid the jockeying of the big nations, such as the US, China, Brazil, India, the political leaders in many other areas of the world feel emboldened to assert their own interests, believing that the benefits of aggressive action may outweigh the costs. He quotes the Chinese political scientist Zhen Yongyan as describing the old order as something that is disintegrating. And, he says, countries are brimming with ambition, like tigers eyeing their prey, keen to find every opportunity among the ruins of the old order. Yongyan is well connected to elements of the current establishment in Beijing, so it is easy to see the endgame in his observations. In the light of this, and in some ways to counter it, the strength and influence of regional groupings has significantly increased. Organizations such as the European Union have taken leadership roles in, for example, the Ukraine war alongside NATO. In some instances, this alignment of the EU has conflicted with NATO members. Turkey, for instance, has found itself at odds with the EU leadership. Likewise, the African Union and the Arab League have found a renewed voice as a consequence of a more proactive representation and confidence in their ability to voice opinions that may run counter to the declining influence of the great powers. ASEAN, for instance, now has a role, effective possibly, in managing conflict in Myanmar more than any other international actor, a role that has greatly enhanced its status, while the Organization of American States, still headquartered in Washington and more beholden than most to the US, is beginning to assert its independence from its North American patron. So where does media and democratic governance come into all of this? I would say that the principles that drive the global quest for honesty and truth in reporting, in the dissemination of information and the need for citizens to be provided with unvarnished integrity has never been more essential. The United Nations is at risk in compromising its authority and its status, not through its own volition, but because of the power of the Big Five in controlling the heart of the UN, the Security Council, which has been severely impacted by its own constitution, which was essentially as frozen in 1945 in the same way as the American Constitution was frozen in 1776. The 50 framers of the UN who gathered in San Francisco in 1945 were victors in major global confrontations. The UN membership led by the US and Great Britain and the former allies were filled with an eternal optimism that once Nazi and fascist evil had been vanquished, it would never appear again, or, if its emergence were detected, the mechanisms were in place and were sufficiently strong to deflect and prevent global conflict and restore tranquility to the world. This was tested almost immediately by the Korean War and a number of smaller conflicts. However, the vision of the founders of the UN was sufficient, and the world was still emotionally vulnerable and reeling from its success in preventing an escalation of conflict. However, now the world has changed. America's power to control the world stage has been severely compromised, both by its own apathy to anything that is not local, and on the international scene by many of them trained in high-octane American colleges and universities, who have learned well and who have returned home. The rise of a multipolar alternative to multilateralism has created a new paradigm and has given a greater emphasis on the divide between the global north and the global south, which I suspect will be a major factor in global issues and relations over the next decade. And for the American framers of the 1776 Constitution, I suspect if they were to return to planet Earth today, none of them would either recognize or even feel comfortable with the current American political environment. The War of Independence was conditioned not only by the desire of a suppressed population to free itself from tyranny and injustice, but it was also controlled by the social, technological, and environmental conditions that prevailed at the time. Accommodating these issues in 1776 bears no comparison to the realities of the 21st century. Yet, a Supreme Court focuses on determining the thinking of the framers of the Constitution to contemporary problems. And however well-intentioned and intellectually vigorous, their exercise fails to take into account that the world is not as it was in 1776, when these worthy gentlemen debated the future of America in Philadelphia. Kellyanne Conway, counselor in the previous administration in Washington, might have vanished into the obscurity from which she emerged had it not been for a momentous comment she made on January 22nd, 2017, when she boldly stated that an obviously inaccurate comment from the press secretary at the White House had merely been the expression of alternative facts. In some ways, we must thank Mrs. Conway for asserting at the beginning of the 21st century that truth, if that concept is in any way related to fact, is relative, liable to interpretation, and in the view of apparatchiks like Joseph Goebbels before her, a handy tool in the hands of unscrupulous politicians. Hence is the challenge presented to groups such as this, the Center for Media and Peace Initiatives. At the very least, Ms. Conway spoke openly and with conviction, but in so doing, she brought to the fore an insidious contradiction between forces that say they are representative of truth and accuracy in reporting, and as representatives of democratic governance, and those who contradict them with alternative claims. Unless you were there, who do you believe? And what criteria do you use in order to justify your decision? What would the fathers of the American Constitution make of a politician like George Santos? And how would they have handled the problems that he has undoubtedly raised in terms of political and legislative integrity? Who to believe has never been more an issue of critical and moral concern. We can all excuse the eccentric or the misguided, as long as that person does not hold power, and with that power, the ability to silence the opposition and attract a cadre of followers. But the growth of social media has created a new world of confusion, which has been exploited by those who are pushing specific agendas, not all of them accurate, not all of them truthful. This weekend, if you have been following the news, you will have learned about the divisive social media targeting of both pro-Israeli factions and those who are promoting the Palestinian cause, and creating, for instance, a viable confusion among recipients about the relationship between Hamas and Palestine, equating one with the other, and consequently apportioning Hamas violence to the character and nature of the Palestinian people. Usually hidden in this messaging is a disregard for some of the realities that are essential for an objective analysis of the current crisis. Reason, therefore, comes into conflict with emotion. And when there is a global crisis of this magnitude, of the magnitude we are seeing in the Ukraine, and between Israel and a terrorist organization, which is also acknowledged as a political leader, then we have exactly the conditions that David Leonhard drew our attention to. This is one that encourages states and pseudo-states to abuse the rule of law with seeming impunity, and in so doing to utilize the weakness of the current world order and its de facto leaders to benefit political leadership and aggrandizement by renegade nationalistic actors. The idea behind so much of what we're seeing on the global political stage today is the forging of alliances and affiliations that are designed not to encourage the resolution of global conflict, but to justify an emerging polarization. However, we should not give up hope. Despite the news that the leadership of COP28 may be engaging in oil negotiation deals with nations in Dubai, the power of the media in drawing attention to alleged abuses picked up by the mainstream media this morning is an indication that all is perhaps not lost. However, vigilance is a key feature of this new world order, which may not be as brave as it is susceptible to intimidation. And for the Order of Malta, with almost a millennium of experience behind our governance and management, we acknowledge that we served in Jerusalem 950 years ago and have now become a global community with the same needs, but experiencing a much wider array and sophistication